Well, we're going to get going now. I know you're still eating, and that's fine. Just don't chew too loudly. But what a delight. You know, I love coming to these things. I see a number of old friends and new friends and friends that I don't even know yet. Some people just today, some people a week or so, and others for quite some time, like my friend Bill Gluba here, the recent mayor of Davenport, and Maria Bribriesco is standing there behind Cliff. Well, she's sitting there. Maria! It's just really nice to have you guys all here. The last, I don't know, 47 years, as I think of it. I've been living in this world that was not the world that I grew up in. And I came of age and I was told, well, there's this war in Vietnam and you got to go kill people that you don't have a beef with or get killed yourself, or we're going to throw you in prison. Or you can leave the country. Yeah, that's nice. I've never been to another country before at that age. And it really kind of shook me up. And it was just like, seriously? This is not the world that I grew up in. And then as time goes by, I started learning about how fair our society was not being to women, and how we were trashing the environment, and how we had to reach the state of bad, mutually assured destruction with nuclear weapons, and how some of these states were killing poor people because they got caught doing something that shouldn't be done, like maybe killing somebody and didn't have any defense. And there were a lot of innocent people that I discovered were being killed. And then more recently, we see this thing with the Dakota Access Pipeline. And it was a month ago, 5 weeks ago today, that we started the 16th year in America's longest war in Afghanistan. And when you think about it, you're not hearing much about that war anymore, are you? We've got 6 media conglomerates that are controlling 95% of the messaging. We don't hear about that stuff. I don't know. I don't see that it's about terrorism, and I don't see it's about the heroin that's coming in this country and killing our kids. What I do understand is that there's a ton, a lot more than a ton, of lithium in the mountains in Afghanistan, and they want that. And I think they're likely to send it. And when they mine it to Vietnam, where the labor rate is 28 cents a day, make it into batteries, sell them at Walmart, and Walmart will take their profits, and will they keep it in this country? No, they'll ship it off to the Cayman Islands. I was invited to hear somebody by the name of Paul Cienfuegos in Iowa City back about 6 months ago. And Paul was talking about this thing, community rights. I'm going like, yeah, okay, well, that's interesting. But he was intriguing, and the stuff that I'd heard about community rights was intriguing. It's probably one of the many reasons why you're here tonight. And I listened to him, and he talked about how we need to assert our rights to clean air and clean water, not to have hazardous chemicals trespassing on our private and public lands. We have a right to stop the factory farms that are polluting our rivers and creating a dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. And I had been learning how Iowa is oversaturated with concentrated animal feeding operations, or CAFOs. We have over 9,000 CAFOs in Iowa. I understand over 23 million hogs. But there's only 3 million human beings. And I know you've been eating, but I'm going to take liberties and mention it anyway. The manure output, I won't get graphic, with the hogs in a matter of a small handful of days in Iowa alone is equal to the total manure output of all the human beings in the United States for a whole year. Now, how much of this can we take? And yet, we go to the Environmental Protection Commission hearings, and we see how they make these laws and they don't listen to the people who are saying, you know, we need to not do this and not do that, and not have a situation for daddy's got a CAFO, mommy's got a CAFO, and Junior's got a CAFO, and Susie's got a CAFO, and have thousands, tens of thousands of hogs in one concentrated area. And weekly I'm reading press releases from the Division of Natural Resources about the runoff that's killing fish, thousands of fish every week in the rivers in Iowa. And there's like 754 rivers, something like that, 724, over 700, that most of them are polluted. So I listened to Paul, and I said, we got to see about doing that kind of thing with community rights, asserting our rights, having community bills of rights here in Scott County, because I've heard people are concerned about the CAFOs, people are concerned about having a livable wage, and having fair labor practices and so on. And I was kind of concerned about what they call the Rock Island Clear Line, which is pumping the electricity from the wind farms in central Iowa across to Chicago. And I remember back in my days fighting the Seabrook nuclear power plants with the Clamshell Alliance back in the 70s, where, by the way, they had 17 votes against those plants, and they were building them anyway. Clearly a failure of democracy. But those lines for the electricity have health hazards with the electromagnetism, and I was trying to find out about that. And this outfit called the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, CELDF.org, Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, has been doing this for well over 20 years, and I learned that they have been fighting on a community basis in over 200 communities around the country successfully in fighting off CAFOs and fracking and so on, virtually shutting down fracking in the state of New York and making great headway in Pennsylvania. So I called them, and they connected me with somebody in New Hampshire that's talking about the wires, and she said, well, you know, you have to watch out for the colonization. I said, colonization? What do you mean? You know, this is not Santo Domingo, Puerto Rico or something like that. And she explained some, and I said, that sounds interesting, and I didn't realize until I started thinking about it, and especially until I read Jane Ann's lead essay in the book that she happens to have, the POCLAD book, Program in Corporations, Law and Democracy, called Defying Corporations, Defining Democracy, okay? She has the lead article, the lead essay in there about colonization. It's help, I've been colonized and I can't get up. And when you think about it, and I've been talking about this with people and writing about it on Facebook and so on, my ancestors came over on the Mayflower, and we got along pretty well with the indigenous peoples, the natives, until the Brits came over, and they colonized. Maybe you heard something about 13 colonies. Maybe you heard something about this Boston Tea Party where they threw the tea in the river because they did not want to pay the taxes on it. And we fought them back. We would not be colonized by them. And then we turned around and we colonized the First Nation peoples and put them on reservations and wrote treaties with them that we've been breaking ever since, I think you'll agree. Which is infuriating and embarrassing. But I realized that, yeah, Afghanistan, we're colonizing them. Vietnam, we were colonizing them for the oil. The Middle East, the oil. South America, they've been tearing down the Amazon forests and having palm oil trees growing, coconut trees for the palm oil, and adult fruits. And no wonder they hate us all over the world. We've got a problem with terrorists. They just don't know what to do. Meanwhile, we're paying for these wars, and they're using our kids as cannon fodder. They're killing their kids. And who's gaining? The key executive officers, the chief executive officers. So I read Jane Ann's essay, and the lights went off in my head, and I said, aha, things really are beginning to make sense. And I had to bring her here so that you guys could hear some of the things that she talks about. She's got, what do you have, about 6 or 8 essays in that book? And she's written a few other books herself that she'll tell you about. I don't want to take all of her thunder. But I can almost guarantee you that tonight when you hear her, you'll be going, aha. And now here's some important things though. One is that we have these sign-in sheets. If you haven't signed in, please do, because this is being recorded along with the first stop in the tour, which was Mason City last night, the second stop in Coralville yesterday, where they are very actively fighting CAFOs, and they've got a 5-person county board who is going to put through an ordinance to do a moratorium on CAFOs in Johnson County. Tomorrow we're down in Fairfield where they're fighting the CAFOs, and I hope that the people that I've invited from Lee County who are fighting the pipeline and Ottumwa, which is fighting the slaughterhouses, come up to hear Jane Ann speak. But I think we need to have a network here in eastern Iowa that is beginning to be called the Community Rights Coalition of Eastern Iowa, to come together and to support each other in communities all over the eastern part of the state in taking our rights back as communities. So that's one important thing. The other important thing is this donation jar. We are about maybe 50% capacity of what it's going to cost for this tour. The folks up in Mason City don't have a whole lot of money, but however you can be generous, it would be a lot of help. That would be good. Jane Ann has her books back there that are for sale. The other literature is free. What's left of it, I fear that there might not be much left by the time we get to Fairfield tomorrow, but c'est la vie. So I'm going to stop flapping my lips here. There will be a form you can fill out and what do you call it, Jane Ann? Evaluation. Thank you, evaluation form. And please do that. Before the discussion, we'll be passing that out. So here's Jane Ann. I would have to say that she is, in all deference to my women friends here, one of the smartest people I've ever met in my life. Absolutely. So please welcome her.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. Thanks to everyone who helped arrange this and the logistics of getting me to speak in 4 places in 3 days in my neighbor state is really very difficult, and I want to thank Bob and all the other people and groups who worked to get that done. I also do want to urge you to fill out the evaluations that are going to be passed out in between a talk and a comment period. That really helps us all know what's helpful and what isn't, and what we should spend more or less time on. The people who brought me here include not only a variety of local groups and individuals, but the group for whom I am essentially a resource, and that group is called Community Rights Groundwork. Their sole purpose is to provide support for groups that are trying to pursue various community rights sorts of efforts, regardless of how they're going to do it. The idea is to support them in the direction that they want to take. And that includes both understanding legal concepts or history or that aspect, and it also includes assistance in organizing and group dynamics and all that kind of stuff. So here's a brochure about them. I just ask that you pass it around, leave the extras at the back. Now, I'm assuming a mixed audience in that maybe some of you have heard a little bit about community rights. Is that accurate? Maybe from Bob, if not from anyone else? Yes. But probably very few of you have really heard a lot about it or gone to a long workshop and stuff like that. So that puts me in the position of being something like first contact here. And I'm going to give it a good try. I have been working on community rights or their forerunners for over 20 years, and that actually puts me at a disadvantage in one sense, in that, as Bob has pointed out to me after these talks, I know a lot about it, and a lot of it's become second nature to me, so sometimes I don't guess right about how I should introduce it the first time to people who really aren't familiar with it. So I'm trying my best, and you should feel free to correct me and pepper me with questions during the comment period if I'm not hitting right, or if I haven't hit right. Also, probably to get community rights across really well, you probably need repeated contact or like a weekend workshop, something like that. I'd like to point out that the people who sort of started it, which is the Program on Corporations, Law, and Democracy in 1993 and 4, took them a few years of pretty intense research to begin putting the pieces together. But I'm going to do my best. As for my bio, I'm going to tell you little things about my bio throughout the talk, but actually probably less than I have in other cases, because I'm trying a new approach tonight. I thought about it, and I'm talking about this in a way that I think will be helpful to you, so you let me know how it goes. But before I get going, I want to say two things out front. Number one, I am not a lawyer. Nothing I say should be construed as legal advice or advice on legal strategy. What I am is a corporate anthropologist, so you may think of anything I say as the advice of a corporate anthropologist, and I'm also sort of a legal historian. Secondly, my website is called democracythemepark.org, and it's stamped on some of the materials in the back. And much of what's in this book, the Polklad book, which there's only a couple left of there, can be found at that site, Democracy Theme Park, and also essays and blogs on many aspects of community rights. Excuse me, I've really done a lot of talking in the last couple days. So I'm going to start with a 90-second definition of community rights. Try and get it out there so we're all on the same page as far as that's concerned. Then I want to tell a story. And after that, I'm going to get to what has been announced as the theme of this, which is 4 paths to community rights. What I did was think of 4 different ways, sort of intellectually or emotionally or historically, that you might get into and begin to understand the need for and the essence of community rights. So that's my basic plan. First, the 90-second history, or definition. So, community rights, what is it? 3 parts to it. The first part is abandon regulatory agencies, okay? Just suspend your disbelief at this point and assume that that's okay. We've spent a lot of time arguing and describing how, frankly, they haven't helped us, they don't work, they weren't designed to help us, and so on. But that's really the first step of community rights. Stop working and thinking that you can achieve your ends through whatever you have, DNR, EPA, Power Commission, Public Service Commission, I'm not sure what you call them in Iowa. But that's the first aspect of it. Second aspect of it is when you have an issue confronting you, work to pass a law that actually addresses that issue. And don't be shy about it, don't be indirect. If you want no CAFOs, the law should say no CAFOs. If there's any doubt, define CAFO, okay? If you want no pipeline, say no pipeline. Now the third part is tricky and very new from the point of view of regulatory approach to things. The third point is not going to make sense to you right now, but I'll say it, and as I go through the talk, you'll be able to fill it in. The third part is you list all the protections and powers and rights that corporations currently have under current law. And you make a list of them and you say, and by the way, in this law that we're passing, these do not apply in this county or whatever your unit is. Okay? In other words, the corporation cannot count on the usual things they will do to say you can't pass that law. So that's the essence of community rights. So the first part of those, I just want to comment briefly on abandoning regulatory agencies. The group Program on Corporations, Law, and Democracy was founded in 1993 by 2 men who had been spending their whole life doing regulatory activism, what I call conventional activism. And they weren't spring chickens, okay? And they're thinking, we have been working all our life, we're doing all the right things, we're following the law, we're hiring lawyers, we're going to the agencies, and it is not working. It's either not working at all, which is common, or it's not working fast enough or thoroughly enough to address the real problems we have. So they got together to just try to figure out, so what is wrong? You know, we're doing all the right things and it's not working. They were later joined by a third man, Peter Kelman, who's a labor historian and was active in many of the anti-nuke environmental fights that Bob was talking about. And I became their fourth member in 1995. And our sole purpose for getting together was regulatory agencies aren't working, what else is there? My own history had been I was involved in a very long battle against strip mining and a power plant in Texas. It involved almost every regulatory agency you can imagine, from the EPA on down to practically the county dog catcher. It involved the Department of the Army. There was all kinds of land involved. It involved both mining and combustion in a power plant. It involved aquifers, land reclamation, whatnot. And we chased that thing through regulatory agencies for years and years, and even appealed it into court. And we used some procedures in the federal laws, the regulatory law, that no one had ever used before. So we really gave them a run for their money. What happened, and we actually had a referendum too, where we managed to defeat nearly $600 million worth of money that would have funded this strip mine and the power plant. We defeated it in a town of over 200,000 people, where we were outspent 9-1, and even Sierra Club wasn't on our side for historic political reasons. But we didn't get any support from the usual suspects. And we managed to beat it 60-40, okay? So after that was over, I wrote a 900-page dissertation on exactly how that utility company had gotten away with anything they wanted in a myriad of regulatory agencies. That's how I became a corporate anthropologist. After that, I thought, well, this isn't as unreadable as a lot of dissertations, but it's not exactly a handbook. And I decided to write a pamphlet, and the pamphlet became this book, Not in My Backyard, the Handbook. And I'm waving it around now because it's a milestone in my life. It's kind of like the last time when I could honestly say I believed in regulatory agencies, and I wrote a whole book on how to use them. There's other stuff in here that's useful. I don't have any of these books left, but a lot of it is oriented specifically toward regulatory agencies. And when I went around on book tours of this, and I met hundreds and hundreds of people in situations where they were opposing things, every time I talked to another group and learned about another situation, I felt more dishonest, pretending that even if they read this whole book and followed everything, that they were going to win. So I was really at a crossroads when I ran into these three other people who had come to the same conclusion in their own lives. Regulatory doesn't work. So off we went to discover what might be wrong. And we end up reading History of Corporate Law and History of Corporations, which also dovetails very quickly with constitutional law. Not something I planned on, but that's where we went. So again, just to remind you, the 3-point definition, quickie version of community rights. Number 1, set the regulatory agencies aside. Number 2, write the law that you really want and think you need. And number 3, incorporate into the law a list of the things you know the corporation is going to list and invoke as their source of power to tell you you don't have the power to pass those laws, and say that those do not apply in our county. Now I want to tell that story before I totally forget about that. So during the course of this long fight against this strip mine and power plant, when we first started on it, there were a whole bunch of things in the plan that we read, and as far as we could tell, was completely illegal according to law, because we read the law and the regulations too. And reading their own description of the project, and sometimes using their own reports, we thought they can't do this. And these are the things that we found, some of them. The law said that you could not do a project like this if there was previous underground mining and abandoned mines on the site. Well, everyone in the community knew there were abandoned mines on the site. 8 or 9 mining companies had mined there. Underground, there was information about it at that little historical society in the county. And occasionally giant sinkholes would open up in people's pasture land, and everyone knew it was the abandoned mines. We thought, that's great. Second thing was they couldn't do this project if they were going to destroy the habitat of endangered species. Well, there was an endangered species there, the Houston toad, which lives in what are called intermittent streams, which they have a lot of in Texas. In fact, most of them are fairly intermittent. It's a very special environment to evolve in. Thirdly, there was a law that said you couldn't do this if you had to move, if you had to move county roads. Well, there were plans to move several roads in the project plans that we saw. Fourth, they said you couldn't do this if it's near a park. Well, there was a park right in the middle of the area they wanted to strip mine. And if you looked on the map, there was a little green place that said park on it. You know, it was a park. Fifth, they said you couldn't do it if there was a cemetery on the land. And there was one of these small country cemeteries, you know, out in the middle of nowhere off a road with little trees growing on the side. And finally, there was a law that said you couldn't do that if you were going to destroy prime farmland. And there was prime farmland in the area. So we were sort of embarrassed that they had done such a bad job preparing the project. And when we got a chance to go to the hearing, we just ripped them on all of these matters, quoting their own studies showing how, in at least these 6 ways and many others, what they were proposing was against their own laws. And we thought we were done, you know, in a great mood after that hearing and went home and stuff. Well, year after year after year later, things turned out differently, and I'm just going to tell you what happened with these 6 cases. The underground mining, okay? What happened with this? When it was just widely known that there was previous mining and abandoned mines under this area. What they did was put 2 engineers up on the stand after they were sworn in, and they testified that the reason that there were sinkholes and, you know, things crumbled in all and so on was not because of underground mines, it was because of badger holes. And they said that, and I was in the room when they said that with someone from our group, and we almost lost it. I later looked up the distribution of badgers in that county at that time, and there had been no evidence by naturalists that anyone had ever seen a badger in that county. So whatever. But that got them off the hook. Endangered species, this thing about the Houston toad living in intermittent streams. Okay? No problem, they said. We got engineers. Our engineers will build you an intermittent stream. You want an intermittent stream? We'll build it for you. So that satisfied the regulatory agencies. Moving the county road, that was an easy one. The county commissioners conferred among themselves, and it turned out, well, maybe they've been thinking about improving their county road system anyway, and maybe that would have involved some rerouting of the roads. And when they found out that the utility company was going to contribute financially toward this project, that was a slam dunk, and the moving the county road thing didn't matter. Near a park. Well, again, they put experts on the stand to testify, and in this case, their testimony was that it wasn't really a park, despite the green spot on the map and the sign in front of the area and the picnic table. They testified that it was a non-park park. and that worked. That worked.
Oh my goodness.
The cemetery. I went out there on the day they were going to take care of this. It was a road in the middle of nowhere, and I can see it in my mind's eye right now. Anyway, when I got out there, it was a hot day, but most days in Texas are hot days. There are a few cold ones. And there was a row of 25 or 30 protesters in front of where the cemetery was a little bit off the road. And they were all dressed up in their Sunday best, and they were carrying signs, and one of the signs said, RIP, resist interference by power companies. Okay? And they were out there to protest what was happening in the cemetery. Along one line in the cemetery, in the little shade provided by the few trees, there were a row of these white plastic chairs that everybody has on their porches and so on. And over it was laid this velvet material, really thick, kind of undulating in waves. And sitting in those chairs were the descendants of the people who had been buried in that cemetery as tracked down by the utility company. And tending to the needs of the people sitting in those chairs was a clergyman going from one to another, trying to comfort them as they sat there and watched what? Backhoes digging up the cemetery, coming in from this side, very loud things, just kind of scraping up And every time they scraped a bunch of stuff up from the soil, they would move back, turn off, and into the hole that was opened up would jump an archaeologist with a paintbrush and start brushing what was there to see if maybe there was a piece of wood from a coffin or some remains there, okay? And actually, I forgot to mention this earlier today, but there was also an independent film crew, and they were running around saying, this is so visual, this is so visual. Anyway, it was really an overwhelming, difficult scene, but there are legal ways to remove it, and they had done it. It had to do with sort of buying off one of the churches who had some connection to the cemetery and also the family members, but that was done, forget that. Then the last one, prime farmland. Any idea on how they got out of this?
Money.
Pardon me?
They paid.
Well, I don't know who they could have paid. They needed an argument at any rate. And this one might have been sort of our fault. I mean, we thought prime farmland has got to be a certain kind of dirt. Silty clay loam, sandy clay, something. They can't just make this up. And we knew that the USDA, Department of Agriculture, defines prime farmland. And there was a lot of that type of dirt in these areas which we knew of. But what we didn't realize was that this rule came out of the Federal Office of Surface Mining. And when they defined prime farmland, they listed the USDA definition, but then a couple paragraphs down they said something else. And they added what is called a historic use provision. In other words, in addition to being this type of dirt, in order for this to qualify as prime farmland, this has to be used in like 8 out of the last 12 years for one of these purposes or to grow one of these crops. And since the economy had changed and so on, the area did not qualify as prime farmland. Anyway, so at this point I just want to say welcome to the Democracy Theme Park. That's why my site is called Democracy Theme Park, because we got all kinds of laws that seem like they'd look good and regulations too. But frankly, and we can do these things like go to hearings and vote and so on, but in an important sense, we can push the buttons, but they're not connected to anything. Okay, so I call this regulatory agency activism or conventional activism. And the fact of the matter is you can make a really good argument that it's working for the corporations more than it's working for us. And in fact, it regulates citizens and what they can do much more than it regulates corporations. And the people who are working on behalf of the corporations and utilities that want to do this, they're paid, they're full-time, they're specialized, whether it's in eminent domain, getting you to sign a lease, managing to get a permit when there's prime farmland or whatever it is. They're definitely experts on this. Now, I've given you the beginning of a critique on regulatory activism. I could go on for weeks, but I'm not going to do that here. You're going to have to ask for that if you ever want it. But we had all gotten to the point in POCLAD where we really couldn't take it seriously anymore. But we also realized that it's not easy to reject something if you don't have an alternative to it. So, okay, so what if I convince you that regulatory agencies are not working? You maybe know that already. If you have nowhere to go after that, there's little incentive to reject regulatory agencies. Well, that's what community rights activism is. That's why I'm so enthusiastic about it. So, I concocted these 4 different paths which a human being might take to get from where you are, usual conventional activism using regulatory agencies, to a position where you are ready to accept community rights. So I'm going to sketch out what these 4 ways might look like, and sort of in doing that maybe try and bring some of you along on one or more of the ways, even though I can just give a summary here. And when I finish that, I'm going to probably too quickly go through a list of things that I have put together that I think characterizes community rights activism. There's a dozen of them. And I'm not going to be able to explain them all in length, but I'm just going to list them so maybe they'll give you the sense of the overall picture of what community rights activism represents. So my first path is what I called regulatory divorce, the D-I-V-O-R-C-E, which means that one way or another, you're like with me and the other 3 or 4 people who started POCLAD. One way or another, you are so up to here with regulatory agencies that you just cannot continue. And I'm going to give you some maybe reasons for it. It may be that through a lot of experience or enormous resources spent or exhaustion or frustration or whatever, you just can't stand the thought of dealing with a regulatory agency again and you're ready for Plan B. That might work. Or it might be because you are really tired of having to go into the agencies and when you want to say no CAFOs, being forced to argue about parts per million and slope gradients and rainfall probabilities when that's really not your concern at all. There's no room in a regulatory agency to really say what you want. That's not on the table. The question is, under what conditions will we grant this permit, which in fact becomes a permit to pollute. It legalizes a certain level of pollution. Maybe it's because you're tired of having to hold your temper in regulatory agencies as you attend hearing after hearing and see experts up there really lying, like the examples I give you, saying things you know aren't true, and you think they know aren't true, but you can't say anything about it because they have advanced degrees in engineering or whatever, and they're sworn in under oath. Maybe you would want to reject regulatory agencies because you have spent years and a small fortune on appeals from them. After you've gone through all the regulatory hearings, appeals to courts, and that hasn't worked either. Of course, that's because courts are sort of understood and instructed to, unless something really bizarre is happening, follow what regulatory agencies say, because regulatory agencies are paid for by the state and taxpayers. They're staffed by experts, and they're supposed to do the state's business, so it takes an enormous amount of evidence or special situation to overthrow what a regulatory agency decision is. Maybe you're tired of the regulatory agencies because the regulatory agency decision makers, hearing examiners, board, commission, whatever they have been moving around in a revolving door in between industry and the regulatory agencies. It's extremely common to find people, they get trained by the government, they work in the regulatory agency for a while, and then when they know everything about the permits, the private company buys them off and puts them on their environmental force whose purpose it is to figure out how to get permits. Okay, and then there's a bunch of newbies in at the regulatory agency. Maybe it's because when the regulatory agencies are doing their business, the opinions of affected communities about whether this facility is right for their community is just not a factor in what the regulatory agencies are considering. They're out there with whatever they're doing, parts per million. Maybe it's because when you go to a regulatory agency and you actually get to testify, you have 5 minutes to explain why your entire community opposes a project, okay, which you think is going to wreck the community or devastate it in some other way. Maybe you are ready to reject regulatory agencies because you're tired of watching your DNR go around measuring fish. Whoops, sir, that's too short, that's a ½ inch too short, throw her back in or whatever. While another part of the DNR is going around giving permits to pollute, to CAFOs and many other facilities, because that's essentially what a permit amounts to, that are going to pollute and degrade the same waterways that the fish was pulled out of. Okay? Or maybe you have a slightly more intellectual reason to want to reject the regulatory agencies. Maybe you read some history of them, and there's some history of them in here. And on my website, it's an article called Sheep in Wolf's Clothing. Maybe you read that history and you realize that regulatory agencies, I realize this sounds like a conspiracy, but read some of the stuff in this article and in other references I give you. They were designed by corporations to replace democratic mechanisms that actually did express the views of the communities. And what I'm going to read you here is from that article, Sheep in Wolf's Clothing. That would be regulatory agencies. And this article is full of quotes like this, but other people have quoted this quote a lot, and I have to say it is a good one. This is a quote from a number of railroad executives who were among those who helped form the first Federal Regulatory Commission, and they're describing to each other in internal documents what they really want the Regulatory Commission to be like, okay? What is desired is something having a good sound, but quite harmless, which will impress the popular mind with the idea that a great deal is being done, when in reality, very little is intended to be done. And I'm not going to go on and on about regulatory agencies, but there's lots of stuff like that. If you're interested in, I can cite you a couple excellent books if you want to read whole books on it. One of them I should mention is by a man named Kolko, K-O-L-K-O. It's called The Triumph of Conservatism. And he basically, his first book was just about railroads. Maybe that's really too concentrated. But this second book is about how the whole first range of regulatory agencies, from the 1880s to like the 1930s or 40s, I don't remember where he stops, how it came about in industry after industry, largely at the instigation of the industry. Because regulatory agencies work great for many people in industry. They help the large corporations, they help put the small ones out of business because they can't go through all the rigmarole and expense that it takes to get all your regulatory permits. Regulatory agencies also act like a perfect shield. They block both legislatures and corporations from the wrath of the public. And they try to direct it toward these regulatory agencies where you get 5 minutes to talk about parts per million. I think, just in summary about regulatory agencies, maybe you realize that basically they regulate citizens more than they do corporations. Maybe you realize that they do concentrate all three branches of government in one place, because within one place they have judicial functions, legislative functions, and executive functions. In other words, they're in a sense making the law, because when you write a regulation you have large interpretive powers. They enforce the law through executive section, and then they also judge the law because they have their own administrative law judges or hearing examiners. And they're often been called the fourth branch of government for exactly that reason. And they grant huge discretion. And maybe, to paraphrase one of the famous periodical studies that's done of regulatory agencies, you realize that in regulatory agencies, procedure always wins out over justice, fairness, policy, or democracy. So, that's the end of the first path. In one way or another, you get really saturated with the regulatory failures and you just can't deal with them anymore, and that makes you ready to consider an alternative, which community rights is. So now, the second path. I call the second path the perp walk, like a corporate construction project. And what I'm talking about here is if you read through history and the changes in law that were made to accommodate the needs of corporations against the needs of communities and against the needs of democracy. One of the best sources here is a book by Morton Horowitz, not Horowitz, Horowitz. And it's a 2-volume one, and I have to say it's a difficult book. So the Kolko one is very readable. This is not so, but I wanted to tell you where I got a lot of it from. It's called The Transformation of American Law. And he goes through with a fine-tooth comb changes in American law from the beginning of this country to, when does he end? Maybe 1960 or something like that. But I'm just going to give you the best of, a couple fun examples from it, and then walk you through a few other things. What happened was that since the beginning of this country, since 1819 and the early 19th century, but definitely accelerating between about 1870 and the 1930s, corporations began picking at little aspects of law, anything that worked against them, and making little changes or big changes that ended up turning it in their favor. And the first example I'm going to talk about is barn burn downs and killed cows. Okay, so we're talking the early days of the railroad corporation. Much corporate law comes out of cases about railroad corporations because they were the big corporations during the time when a lot of this was happening. Just happens that way. Just like now, a lot of the internet-related companies are right in the forefront. So in the early days of the railroad, 1830 till the Civil War, railroads were slowly being built and expanding, and they hadn't yet connected across the country. But This isn't true in all countries, but in the United States they were burning wood. So the railroad companies, this is why a lot of the timber companies came out of the railroad companies, because the railroad companies were granted huge tracts of land because they needed timber, railroad ties. Can you imagine how many trees that take? So it wasn't just the railroad ties and the maintenance of that, it was also they were burning wood in the trains. And the trains had to stop frequently just to load on giant piles of wood to burn, keep the trains moving. So invariably what would happen is they would have the wood burning and the little ashes or sparks would go out, and sometimes they would drift over and they would like land on a farmer's field, a nice dry wheat field ready for harvest. And wheat was actually big up in Wisconsin during the mid-19th century. I don't know if you were already growing corn in Iowa, but sparks would drop out, start the field on fire, and in some cases it just kept burning and got to the barn and burned the barn down. Now, suffice it to say, a farmer is going to notice if their barn is burned down. And if it happened 45 minutes after the train passed and everyone noticed the train pass and then saw the smoke, it's going to be a fairly open and shut case, even without iPhones to take pictures of the evidence. So that's one concern of farmers. Another thing that happened, which is related, is that there was livestock out there, like cows. And the cows, there wasn't, at this time, there wasn't as much barbed wire fencing as was later used to just fence in and out everything. So you sometimes had livestock that wandered onto the railroad tracks with the very unfortunate result that the animal would get killed when the train came by and wasn't able or didn't bother trying to stop. So again, a dead cow that had obviously been mangled by a train, this isn't something you can ignore, and a cow might be a very big part of the farmer's whole resource base. So what happened originally was when farmers had either of these things happen to them, they went to their local courts and they said, train came by, burnt down my barn, or train came by, killed my cow, and they would get compensated for it. First of all, the local courts were knowledgeable and sympathetic. Secondly, it was really obvious that the train going by was the cause of this. There weren't any aliens then coming down and dissecting the animals, so they didn't have to worry about that. And this was really hurting the corporations. They didn't want to pay for a burned down barn, even though it was obviously their train that caused it, or the cow and stuff like that. So they devised two things that were later to have a big effect on American law, just to give you an idea how little they are and how molecular the level of these changes. One of the things they introduced was they changed from the nuisance doctrine to the negligence doctrine. Remember, I'm talking not as a lawyer, but as a corporate anthropologist. In nuisance, really generally speaking, and in these cases, if the corporations caused the damage, the burned barn or the killed cow, they paid for it. Okay? Once you introduce negligence into this, you say, well, we shouldn't expect the corporations to compensate for this damage unless not only did the train cause the problem, but the operator of the train, the corporation, was acting in a negligent manner. So this made it much more difficult for the farmer to prove that just lost my cow in my barn and you can't bother to pay me for it. And then they did something else, and this actually took place over a long time, but it gives you some sense how complicated this is. And that is that, generally speaking, if these people or others seeking damages from a corporation went into state court, they often got a hearing that was fair and pretty much sympathetic to them. Okay? Corporations didn't like this either. So they devised various ways, and we're not going to go into them now, of making sure that those cases were not heard in state court. You've heard the expression, geez, don't make a federal case out of it. Well, that expression came out of the fact that if you make a federal case out of it and go into federal court, you pay higher fees, you go farther away, you need different lawyers, you need different permissions. It's much more difficult for a farmer to go into Chicago and federal court and get compensated for a cow or a barn than it is in their local court. So just to give you that example.
Jane?
Yes.
Could I talk?
So talking about? Just finishing up the cows?
And the maybes, maybe the, yeah, the end of the regulatory.
Sorry, Anna.
Yeah, I did that, and I'd start talking about the
I don't
federal
think it's
courts.
long enough.
Right, federal courts, okay.
Yeah, the federal left off, yeah.
Okay,
I didn't even notice it before.
so, sir, when you give me the go-ahead, I'll start again. I mean, I won't start again, I will resume.
Pick it up.
Okay, so after that little law enforcement interruption, which I hope turns out okay for the people whose cars were just burgled, I was talking about the second path that you might take to get to community rights, and I called it the perp walk, because it describes how corporations, bit by bit, molecule by molecule, manage to sort of twist and warp the laws that we have so that they privileged corporations and basically degraded the possibility of democracy. And I just gave you the example of the kilt cows and the burnt barns. Okay? And I'm going to skip a lot of these. There are maybe a dozen or two, depending on how you count them, specific things that corporations did that loom large in their defense against any effort to say your local community has the right to pass a law banning something. Okay? I'm going to give you some of the main ones, but also to give you the sense of how they developed. The first one of those that I want to point out is what's usually referred to as the Dartmouth case in 1819. And I'll have to give you a little background here. Legislatures create corporations by writing a charter saying you're now existing, you can do this with the board, your purpose is this, you can do this and that, you can't do that and the other. And these laws were passed regularly, and since the legislature passed them, the legislature could unpass them, and it was called charter revocation, taking away a charter. In the early days of corporations in Wisconsin, and I suspect in Iowa too, since our states are roughly the same age, I think you're senior by a little bit. The last group I asked didn't know what year Iowa became a state. Does someone want to tell me?
1836.
36. Okay, well, there's a little disagreement. You're ahead of us. We are 1848. But anyway, if the legislature decided that they didn't like that group who they just chartered to build the railroad, they took the charter away, and they did this without any interference by the judiciary at all, and without even having to give a reason, okay? So one of the things that happened early on in 1819 was this Dartmouth case, where the argument was about turning an institution into a public institution by changing its charter. And the legislature wanted to do this. It was kind of a public school kind of move to make education a little bit more open and not just for, you know, rich kids going to the equivalent of prep schools. But in that case, the U.S. Supreme Court decided not to let the state legislature change the corporate charter. And the grounds on which they made that decision was they said the corporate charter is not a law like other laws. And you know, laws, you pass a law, we create the Department of Agriculture. 3 years later, you say, no, we don't like you. We're going to change it to the Department of Sustainability. A law is something that you can pass and you can repeal and you can modify and change. That's the nature of legislation. Well, what they did in this Dartmouth case was they said that a corporate charter is not a law. It's something else. It's a contract. That's very special in the Constitution when something gets called a contract, because Article 1, Section 10 says you may not impair the obligation of contracts. So I'm not going to get into the jungle of that, but that was significant when the U.S. Supreme Court said, no, we'll consider that a contract instead of a law. Another thing that states used to do to control corporations. So a state could create a corporation in its own state. That's called a domestic corporation. So if Iowa creates a corporation, that's Iowa's domestic corporation. If that corporation decides it wants to do business in Wisconsin it is called a foreign corporation. Even though that sounds misleading, it's called a foreign corporation. Now before the corporation chartered in Iowa can do business in Wisconsin, someone in Wisconsin, it used to be the Secretary of State, has to give permission, and sometimes it's fairly routine, for that foreign corporation from Iowa to do business there, to sell cupcakes or whatever, okay? So there are two mechanisms by which corporations could be controlled directly. Number one, a state could revoke the charter of its own corporation, or it could decline to allow a foreign corporation from another state to do business there. If, for example, they didn't like what they did, or they thought they would bring contaminants in, or if they thought it would compete inappropriately with one of their own corporations. There were all kinds of reasons. So, one of the levers that states used was they reserved the right to, as a condition of allowing a foreign corporation into the state, say Iowa, and say that a corporation from Wisconsin wants to do business here. What Iowa says to that corporation, that foreign corporation, is, yes, you may do business in our state, in Iowa, but here's a condition. If there are any legal actions taken against you, you must allow those actions to be heard in state court. Okay, we don't want you running to federal court because there's different states involved, which was one trick. This was a really big deal. It's called removal to federal courts. And the states fought very strongly to keep it throughout the late 19th century. And finally, the last time it was revisited was 1922, when the Supreme Court basically said, no way. A state may not require, as a condition of a foreign corporation doing business there, may not require that cases against it be heard in state court. So that is yet another way of getting into federal court and basically getting away from the power of states. Another one you may have heard of. Have anybody heard of corporate personhood? Okay, I'm going to explain it. Anyone who wants to give a 15-minute explanation of it? No. Don't know? Okay, good. I'm going to hopefully spend less time than that and hopefully tell you something useful. The 14th Amendment was passed in 1868 to guarantee the rights of freed slaves. And actually it was the first introduction of the word male into the U.S. Constitution because they wanted to make sure that it didn't allow black women those full rights because there was the suffrage thing going on. Okay, anyway, it was clearly passed to do what you could through a constitutional amendment to ensure the rights of natural persons freed slaves. And two of the parts of it are equal protection before the law and due process. And what happened starting in the late 1880s and solidifying up through the 1930s and 40s when there was the last real argument in courts about it, was the idea that these rights, equal protection and due process, applied to corporate persons too, who were legal fictions, but they were also persons before the law. So the question is, if corporations starting in the late 1880s through the Supreme Court got equal protection rights, what did this give them? In other words, what can you do with a bucket of equal protection? Here, a corporation all of a sudden has this. Well, I'll give you an example. It allows a corporation to challenge any law which it can argue is treating it unlike other persons or other corporations. For example, if you pass a law, and there were many of them, keeping certain corporations out of a state because the state didn't like its business practices, they thought they were competing inappropriately, or they just thought they were going to destroy the state's own industry if they let them in. At any rate, the corporations with equal protection could say, you're not protecting us equal to these other corporations. In fact, you are favoring these other corporations over us because you're letting them do business in your state and you're not letting us in. In other words, making distinctions between different types of corporations was much more difficult if a corporation has a bucket of equal protection from the 14th Amendment. And the other main thing that they got through so-called corporate personhood was a bucket of due process, which said that corporations, corporate persons, are persons before the law and should get due process. Well, what can you do with this? Among other things, it allows corporations to appeal the decisions of regulatory agencies. So before that and without that, regulatory agencies or legislatures would do something to a corporation and that was it. There was no appeal. Why not? Because we're not talking about a natural person there. But with this, corporations were able to again and again appeal legislative actions and the actions of regulatory agencies. And in fact, the first regulatory agency in the country at the federal level, the ICC in 1887, I think, specifically the corporations wouldn't let that pass unless they were guaranteed the right to appeal it to court, because they knew they could do that forever. So I hope that gives you some sense what a right of equal protection and due process gives to corporations. That's what people around are talking about as corporate personhood, which was a gateway to other protections. And remember, these are new. It wasn't always like this. Fourth Amendment protects against unreasonable searches and seizures, and of course is meant to apply to like human beings in their houses and so on. Little by little, people began arguing that corporate persons, after this 14th Amendment, should also get these protections. And in 1906, the Supreme Court ruled in a famous case, Hale v. Henkel, that corporations have Fourth Amendment protection against unreasonable searches and seizures. That was expanded in 1977 in another case where corporate lawyers claimed that an OSHA inspection was a violation of their Fourth Amendment rights, and that was upheld. So to talk about another reason why this regulatory thing wasn't working too well. You've probably also heard of First Amendment rights for corporations. I'm just going to rattle off some dates with what happened during them. In 1978, political speech was recognized pretty clearly in First National Bank of Boston versus Bellotti. It's called the Bellotti case. And this was basically the right of a corporation to spend money to influence a referendum. 1980, commercial speech. Right to commercial speech was protected, and in 1986, the U.S. Supreme Court protected the right to negative free speech. And what this was the right of a utility company, usually a favorite of activists, Pacific Gas and Electric, the right of that utility company to not have any information that it did not agree with distributed and sent along with the utility bills. An activist group or some organization wanted to send some true facts along in the utility bill, and the Supreme Court didn't allow it. Okay, all of those I just went through after the barn and the cow thing were examples of rights corporations have as quote-unquote legal persons before the Constitution. There are some other protections they have that don't go through rights, and they're harder to explain. The one about Dartmouth, the contracts clause, wasn't through rights. I'm going to give you one more example of that. And this I learned a lot about in writing the book Gaveling Down the Rabble, which is about less than one sentence in the Constitution, the Commerce Clause. Now, I was amazed when I read over court cases and state laws, mostly starting from after the Civil War and mostly ending in the 1930s or 40s, about all the things that states and in some cases localities did to protect themselves. And they were really incredibly good laws, things that today we would call green in the large sense, not just environmental, but with the other values you associate with that. For example, states were protecting themselves against double trailers on trucks. They were making laws about train safety. They made a lot of labeling laws over that time about syrup, cantaloupes, tobacco products, country of origin meat. They had all kinds of laws about chain stores because they could see that the chain stores were wrecking the local economy. They had laws about timber or fish processing. They had laws about whether or not their water or their electricity could be sold out of state before their own state got to use what it needed first. They passed laws about meat inspection, and they passed laws about things like hazardous waste dump regulations. In short, you look over the history of the country, the same things we're worried about today. Food safety, transportation issues, resources, energy, protecting health, protecting rivers and stuff were the same issues they were dealing with. And one after another, they got thrown out because the Supreme Court said those laws passed by states and localities were violating the Commerce Clause because they were regulating commerce among the several states. And you really have to read about it a little bit to appreciate how that argument was developed, because it's, even all the law review articles call this one of the most convoluted ones that you will see. And this is a summary from Gaveling of what happened as a result of those and many other laws that the states passed to protect themselves against something which were called unconstitutional. In one sense, the story of the decades since the end of the Civil War in the United States is the story of how so many people came to believe and accept that they lacked the right to do something as commonsensical as keeping poisons out of their communities. Okay? I just want to give one more example from this, because one of the other things states wanted to do when they had foreign corporations coming in and having increasing power, when they had foreign corporations crisscrossing their state in transport and bringing stuff in and obviously making a lot of money in their state, well, they wanted to tax them, because there's a cost to having someone do business in your state. And I just want to go through some examples of states that tried to tax foreign corporations and have, so they could take care of themselves and get something back from the big money the corporations were making in their state. I want to give you a quick example of a few of them, and they all are between 1904 and 1930. All of these thrown out. An Indiana law taxing American Express Company doing business in Indiana. An Arkansas law taxing Western Union Telegraph Company doing business in Arkansas. A Colorado law taxing a railroad corporation that was chartered in Kansas. A Texas law taxing an Illinois chartered construction corporation. A Massachusetts tax on a New Jersey chartered cement company. And a New Jersey law taxing a New Jersey chartered telephone corporation that did interstate business and said that, well, because we're doing business outside of the state too, you can't tax us, and that went over. Anyway, that's an example of yet something else that was done, which was not through a corporate right, but another way that corporations managed to gain protections under the Constitution. So we're going to stop it. That part's a little depressing. The only good thing about it is that when you look at that, it does function as a map to go back, and you can have a list of exactly what to undo step by step. It's really very clear. My third path into community rights, I call a glimpse at the moment of creation. And that's because when I first got involved with POCLAD, was suggested to me that I go into the Wisconsin State Law Library and start reading about the history of Wisconsin corporations. I didn't really know what I would find, but what I found really changed me a lot and was amazing, and I think allowed me to understand some things that I would not have understood if someone just told me about them. So sorry, I'm going to do my best, but for me, it took going into the library and seeing this. I went into the library and I saw charters that were passed and then repealed or revoked or changed. I also saw the kinds of conditions that they put on those charters. There are all kinds of conditions that the legislature told them exactly what they could and couldn't do. And so now I'm going to go to an article I wrote which is called Corporations for the Seventh Generation, and you can get this on my website too. It's in this book, but there's hardly any of these left. But you can just look at it there. The article has been called either Fixing Corporations or Corporations for the Seventh Generation, because it's been reprinted. But I'm just going to give you an example of what you see about legislatures using their power to protect their states, okay? And I do have to put in a little caution here that I am well aware of what the United States political situation was in the early and mid-19th century. I'm well aware of the fact that most human beings here did not have rights, and many were being treated as either property as animals or both. So I'm not glorifying this stage in U.S. history, but I am saying that as far as the relationship between the legislature and the corporations that they chartered, there was a very clear relationship which not only have we lost, but most of us never even knew existed. And just knowing it was there and how much sense it makes, I think can make it easier for us to let go of the regulatory thing for something that worked. So here's how it worked. And like I said, it took me looking at those original documents and comparing charters. But here's a summary, again, from Corporations for the Seventh Generation. These are some common features of corporate charters, particularly around before and a little after the period of the Civil War in Wisconsin. And they were common in other states as well. Wisconsin was not an outlier on this. Number one, corporations were required to have a clear purpose. Build a lead mine. And these were things the legislature thought was in the public interest. Build a railroad from A to B. And other things, a manufacturing center, whatever it was. A clear purpose. It didn't say, as it does now, something like, and anything else you can think of and get away with it will make you money. Okay, but that didn't come down from Moses on tablets, that's written into the code. So they were required to have a clear purpose. They were required to fulfill that purpose. If they didn't fulfill that purpose, a couple years later, the legislature would pull their charter. No help necessary from courts. On the other hand, they were not allowed to exceed the purpose. You built an extra 5 miles of railroad, not going to work. They would also pull the charter if they exceeded their purpose. Their licenses to do business, as I implied, were revocable by the legislature, but not only for a reason, but several cases said for no reason at all. In other words, the legislature, since it created them for a public purpose, could uncreate them and didn't have to give a reason, because the legislature was the most direct expression of the people's will, and if they didn't want the corporation without these rights, there was no reason to think that judges needed to intervene. As a matter of course, many of these corporation officers, directors, and agents could be held criminally liable for various kinds of damages, and in some cases double or treble. In many cases, corporations had to have their headquarters in the state where they were chartered. In other words, no more board meetings in the Bahamas, and they were required to hold their meetings there so people in the state could go to their meetings. Often their charters were granted for a specific number of years, like 10, 20, 30, or 5. Corporations were prohibiting from owning stock in other corporations. This gives you a very clear line of who's liable for what. You can't have all these things going on like we have now, where a corporation has so many sub-corporations and they all own stock in each other, so you can sue one that has power, but the one that has power doesn't have any resources, and you can't sue the one with resources because that's shielded. Anyway, just a couple more examples. Oh, I'll give you one more. 2 more. 3 more. Okay, wait, stop. Okay, one of them is that there was like a drastic open records policy, not for all members of the public, but for the legislature. Man, you got papers, we created you, and we want to go inspect them, or we want to send a team of legislators in to look at it. You have to let us. Number 2, they actually set the rates on many things, like for railroads and plank roads, and this is one of my favorites because they told you, okay, this is how much you can charge if someone's bringing 3 cows over for various livestock or bushels of grain and stuff. But one other thing they did actually express their values, because they said, okay, if someone is traveling on this road for the purpose of voting, no charge. Because we want them to do that, and that's value. And another thing they said in some of them, if they're traveling into town because they're going to a funeral, don't charge them then either. So they were making value statements about this. And then I want to read you one of my favorite, which is from a Wisconsin law in 1905. And it actually stayed on the books to the 1950s with much, much, much reduced penalties. Let's see. Okay, I was supposed to finish 45 minutes ago and let you ask me questions. So I'll move along, but I want to read you this. I'm just trying to gauge where we are. So this was a 1905 law in Wisconsin, and when people tell me they want to repeal Citizens United, for me that's a real nothing, or move to amend is pretty much a nothing, and in fact McCain-Feingold was a nothing, and in fact the Federal Elections Commission Act of 1974 was a nothing, and it legalized PAC. This is a something. Well, I'm going to read you this quote, 1905. This is what getting corporations out of politics is. No corporation doing business in this state shall pay or contribute or offer consent or agree to pay or contribute, directly or indirectly, any money, property, free service of its officers or employees, or thing of value to any political party, organization, committee, or individual for any political purpose whatsoever, or for the purpose of influencing legislation of any kind, or to promote or defeat the candidacy of any person for nomination, appointment, or election to any political office. Now that's getting, money and corporations out of politics. So that's a 1905 law in Wisconsin, and if you want a quote on it, you can go to my website, democracythemepark.org, and look at the article on campaign reform, which is called Speak Truth to Power. Okay,
We will never see anything like that in our lifetime, will we?
why not? People act like it's impossible, so they're not trying. They're out there, and here we go, start poke me and get a rant. They're out there trying to repeal Citizens United case. Well, I read the Citizens United case. I read the two cases that it was involved in, that were appealed to get that decision. And I read the laws, one of them a Michigan law, which I think the Austin versus Michigan case was about. Making a short version of this, basically the law that people are asking to be upheld by repealing Citizens United, this Michigan law, is almost a nothing law. It made a teeny change. It assumes that money is speech, and it assumes that corporations have 14th Amendment and First Amendment rights. And that's what we're fighting for, and we're pretending that repealing Citizens United is going to have a big effect? I don't think so. Okay, so that's just a sample. And that's the end of my third. So the three paths in so far. Number one was regulatory, DIVORCE. Number two was the PERP law. As you see, corporations gradually kind of crunching down laws in a way and altering judicial interpretations in a way to decrease democracy. But the third one is a positive one. We look at the measures that were in play when legislatures did control corporations. Okay? Now the fourth path in is real quick. I just call it citizen attitude, or you might say citizen attitude, which is that there are some people under some circumstance who will just say, perceive a problem, a CAFO or something, go to their local elected representatives and say, none of us want a CAFO here, let's pass a law against CAFOs. And they will be told dutifully by their representative or by the counsel for the entity, I'm sorry, that's unconstitutional. And sometimes the citizen just says, and how's that? Instead of saying, oh, I'm sorry, whoops, unconstitutional, what did I do wrong? Which is a common reaction. They'll say, how could it be unconstitutional for us to protect our community against obvious harms that everybody in the community is against? So you don't see that too often, but I think it's possible. Okay, I hope I haven't made a total garble about this. I'm going to try to sort of summarize now. And I'm referring to a list I have, which obviously we don't have time to really discuss, but it's a list of things that I think characterize the community rights approach. It's kind of an expansion of what's behind that three-step 90-second version I gave you before. And I think this might be useful as a list within your group or community to talk about it. It might help you pinpoint what aspects you do or don't understand or might need to do more research on or get help with. It will definitely help you if you engage in a community rights approach and then try to explain this to your neighbor or your elected representative or someone from the news media. And finally, if you do get involved in this and start taking it seriously, I think at some point you will probably want to have a lawyer working with you, either your own or someone from the county or whatever entity you're working with, and you are going to need to explain to a lawyer what it is you're doing, okay, which is not an easy thing. You're going to have to essentially deprogram and reprogram them, unless they're already on board with community rights. Okay, quickly. We don't live in a world where our current laws and regulations are enforced. Every time something blows up, you hear, this hasn't been inspected for 3 years or whatever. Number two, the current laws we have are full of loopholes anyway, even if they were enforced. Number 3, conventional regulatory activism doesn't work for us. In fact, it works for corporations to chase us out into the regulatory agencies and shield legislators and elected officials and corporations from our anger. Okay? Number 4, the government really does create corporations. You don't believe me? Go into your state law library and actually look at it, and amazing things happen there. Number 5, the reason the regulatory agency system does not work is that it replaced the system that did, which is legislative direct control of corporations. Okay? And the best place to get a quick read on regulatory agencies is my essay, Sheep in Wolf's Clothing, which is free online. Okay? Number 6, there's a lot of constitutional and legal protections of corporations. We talked about the ones that are rights. We talked about ones that weren't rights, like the Dartmouth case, Contracts Clause, and the Commerce Clause. And there are others. There's something called Dillon's Rule, which applies to most states, which basically says a local municipality can't do much of anything unless the state specifically gives it permission to do so. That's a real sloppy version of it, but that's the essence of it. And there are other state preemptions, like you pass laws against things, and the next time the legislature meets, they pass a law saying, by the way, localities cannot pass any laws about fill in the blank. Number 7, because of these foregoing things, the target of activism is really not corporations, but it's government. Because the government creates the corporations, it protects them and gives them rights and powers, chips off the old block of sovereignty. It sets up and enforces regulatory agencies. Okay? So in a sense, corporations aren't really players. Our problem is with the government, even if it's not the particular elected official, but the government that actually set them up, gave them power, and continues to protect them. Number 8. At a certain point in this group I was with, Program on Corporation Laws and Democracy, we recognized that corporations always use the same protections. Usually there's 5 of them, but there might be up to 17 or 22, I don't know. Whenever you try to do something like ban something, just say, forget regulatory, we're banning this. And those protections tended to be the 14th Amendment, maybe the Commerce Clause, a few other in there. So we realized that you needed a 2-pronged approach. And this is another way of looking at the essence of community rights. Number 1, pass your law that says what you want. No CAFOs, no pipeline. Number 2, make a list, and now you know what I'm referring to. Make a list of the rights and protections that corporations have, or the state preemptions that do not apply here, and say, and by the way, if you're thinking of using any of these things in your defense as part of this law, they don't apply here either. The advantage of that is that corporations then can't be Mr. Nice Guy and say, we just wanted to bring jobs, and you know, we have a very clean strip mine in CAFO here or whatever. Because you have focused in court in a legal document, an ordinance, by saying, we don't accept these protections, corporations have to answer back publicly in court briefs or whatever and say, we do too have equal protection, we do too have due process, and you can't do this. They have to argue to the community itself, you don't have the power to govern yourself, what are you thinking? And this, in a sense, boomerangs on the corporation because people see them arguing the real issue for a change and get really upset, and then you get more support. Just 3 more of these. Another characteristic, I think, is that we all need to get past what's called describing the problem and kind of getting into a mantra of complaining about how bad the CAFO is or pipeline, or even how bad corporate personhood is or something. And actually, if you're talking to someone who already agrees with you that it's a problem, skip that phase and start talking about strategy and what you can do about it. And I think community rights is a really good way to go on this. This frees up a lot of time. I think a lot of people don't realize, because I hear it all the time, how much time they spend kind of like getting into this complaining thing. Just leave that. In contrasting community rights with the regulatory agency approach, you're not just trying to get one thing, like trying to get this agency just this one time, please say no to one of these facilities and so on. You're actually trying to change the way decisions are made. And you're trying to change the fact that most decisions made in regulatory agencies are not made democratically. and you are trying to bring back to your local community the ability to make decisions on harms that affect your community. And so other thing I'd like you to think of, and this is number 12, is that maybe the structure we're accustomed to that works for regulatory agencies, which is usually a bunch of people passing out flyers, a couple fundraisers, a lawyer and 2 experts, or something like that. Maybe that won't work for community rights, since it's a much more deep and long-term approach, and your goals are much broader. They're like taking back your local community's abilities to govern itself. So, really quick ending. Question I have in my mind, if you've heard about community rights and you're not comfortable with it, I'm interested in what things about it are still kind of uncomfortable for you. That's a question that I have, and it would help me to know about. But I want to emphasize it's not just another method. It's a strategy that involves long-term, more like the other side, which has a very long-term strategy. I also want to tell you it's not new. It is what U.S. communities had under the Declaration of Independence, the idea that power comes from the people, not from the sovereign and not from God, comes from the people. And a power that comes from the people can't be taken away by the state. The state can't take a power away from you that it didn't grant you to begin with. The most radical discussions of democracy along these lines I've heard have occurred in law review articles, and these are things written by law professors, which is not the image of the usual rabble-rouser. It's very inspiring and very helpful to be able to read these things and see how clearly they thought about it. There are 2 really famous dissents in 1938 and 1949 to the corporate personhood thing by justices in the U.S. Supreme Court. They're worth a read. And plus, in recent years, this way of thinking has been out among activists, at least since Polklad started thinking about it in 1993. And by this time, hundreds of ordinances have been passed around the country. There's a lot of sample ordinances out there. They've changed and developed over time. And I think they're well worth your while looking at. So you won't be pioneers. You won't be, as Winston Churchill say, you won't be the end. And you won't be the beginning of the end, but you can be the end of the beginning, because the community rights movement is getting to the point where there are now a lot of examples, good and bad, and a lot of diversity out there in how you could approach this. So I hope you get to the point where local communities can regulate more than bar closing hours and school speed limits. And we don't know how it's going to look yet, and there's a diversity of things going on yet, and you are going to be part of it. So, thank you.
Yeah. Was I right? Is she brilliant or what?
Yes.
A couple of things I want to ask you to remember: the donation jar. We are going to have a question and answer session now. Somewhere are the evaluation sheets that were with the sign-in forms that have been passed out, and I don't know where they disappeared to. Somebody handed them to somebody else who handed them to somebody else, and it looks like, you know, please help us understand. It's a whole form on one side of it. So
Yeah,
if you,
could everybody look around? Those are real helpful.
Sign-in sheets over here.
There's another one.
Pass it around.
okay, what's on the? Show me the other side, the bottom side. Yeah, maybe it's over there.
They're just all sign-in sheets.
Bob, pass the sign-in sheet around. Just
Maybe they
Well, I'm looking to see if there's.
It'll say evaluation or something like that at the top.
Yeah, there were a whole bunch of evaluation sheets that were with them. So if anybody sees them in their travels. But, yeah. So let's see what kind of questions you have. And thank you for your tolerance with the interruption with tonight. And my condolences to people. I did get my dirty underwear back.
Where
I
was
did
it?
get my dirty underwear back.
Where was it?
They opened up the bag and it was thrown over there. I got more than that back. Bill, you have a question?
Yes, thank you. That was an excellent presentation. The question I have,
sort of as a former legislator, mayor, supervisor, I've heard the Dillon rule, which was, you know, an Iowa judge, and we've got this statue in Davenport of him at the foot of Main Street. So,
Right,
you know,
this is the origin.
that's Dillon's rule, which we can't do anything, and that's, so the question, the system's been obviously rigged over years against average people, against citizens, by lawyers and judges and courts. Could you give us some specific successes where you've passed local ordinances that, you know, maybe would have been or could be or were challenges that they lost? When clearly you lose under the 14th Amendment, you lose under the 4th Amendment. It's either commerce or it's this.
I can give you something that begins to address that and then follow up if there's more you want. First of all, I can give you statistical evidence. I know examples of a lot of communities, but I don't have all of them in my head. I'm not even sure how many there are. But the statistics that are being bandied about now is that well over 200 community rights ordinances have been passed in one way or another by communities. Either as referendums, I think that's kind of rare, or by a county or parish or township or whatever the local level of government is. The information I get is that in 95% of those cases, nothing happens. It's like the sound of a stone dropping into a very, very, very deep well, one of those things. And the reason is that the corporation has taken one look at it and said, this is really not worth our time, we can just go next door and do what we want to do, or we'll wait 5 years, or whatever they're thinking, but they just go. So, in a sense, they work. And they're very useful for those communities, maybe not permanently. In a few other cases, corporations have come back and sued the legislators or the elected officials, or sued the government entity. And in, I think, at least 3 of those cases, the government entity just says, whoa, we really can't deal with this, it scares them, you know what, out of us, and withdrew the measure, okay? And in 2 cases that I know of, they actually managed, and this is partly the goal of community rights, they managed to get it into court and litigate it into court. And it went 1 or 2 levels in the courts, and then the judges said, no, we're not going to go along with this. But you know the role of courts, like the role of the legal counsel to your county is to see that the law is carried out. So it's that person's duty to tell you, yes, I see this CAFO ban, and it's my duty to tell you this is unconstitutional and illegal in 17 ways, and then you say, we know that, we're challenging that, we don't, and hopefully the person will go along with it. But when you get to the level of judges, their duty also is to carry out the law as is currently understood with all this stuff in it. So at the lower levels, they're supposed to do that. And the only level which really has permission to say, you know what, that's totally wrong, is the U.S. Supreme Court. But what happens at the highest appellate levels is if you, I forget how many of these courts there are, 13 or 17 or something. If all the judges at that level say the same thing, nope, we don't think it's worth it, nope, we're rejecting it, then it's not going to go any further. But when it gets to the point that the courts at that level are disagreeing, and this is the kind of thing that happened with same-sex marriage, for example. They're starting to disagree, or other contentious issues. And some of the courts are saying, you know, there's something to this community rights stuff, and others are saying, no, it's total garbage. When there gets to be enough disagreement there, at the discretion of the U.S. Supreme Court, which can pick its cases, it can say, but that's the conditions when it would, it can say, this is getting interesting. We'll take this case and rule on it. So does that begin to address? And if it doesn't, please come back.
Well, it does, but we both know, all know, it ain't going to change Citizens United. The current Supreme Court, and probably the next 40 years,
Well,
are not going to take a liberal progressive position on any of this stuff.
okay,
I mean, that's...
I agree in most aspects of that, but let me just point one thing out to you. When I was researching this book, Gaveling Down the Rabble, obviously I was very sympathetic to local governments and states, which were passing just really neat laws a long time ago to protect themselves. And I got to see what happened when they got up to the Supreme Court. And on the Supreme Court, do you know which justice was probably among the staunchest in protecting the rights of local communities to protect themselves, along the lines we've been talking about.
Probably Scalia if he's still around, or Holmes or somebody.
No, it was Justice Rehnquist. Rehnquist, if you look at him, who many people consider a hopeless racist, who was Chief Justice for some time and died, I forget when, he wrote some really eloquent court cases at the Supreme Court level, decisions at the Supreme Court level, supporting, and I have them quoted in here, you can look up in the index R. Rehnquist, I'm pretty sure you find them that way, talking about how important it was for states to be able to protect themselves. So the point I'm making there is, just as the supporters of community rights aren't always like progressive Democrats, that it has appeal across the board for people who really want to take care of their communities at the local level. When you get to these issues, it's not that obvious among appointees of, say, Obama versus you-know-who. It's not that obvious which among them might tend to lean towards some sort of support of local democratic power.
My question was, give me some successes, specific examples where communities have made it, gone all the way to the top.
Nothing has gone all the way up. That's why I gave this statistical thing. The farthest any have gone is 1 or 2 levels into the courts, and they were thrown out. If you look at the details of the civil rights struggle, it's similar in the beginning, and that's the analogy I think of. But you're correct. Nobody up to the Supreme Court saying, yay, community rights yet.
When you're saying they're thrown out, are you saying that the corporations suing the community, the legislature, whatever, like their case is thrown out and it goes for the community, or it's that it's thrown out and the ordinance is pulled away because the judge says that they can't do that?
Thanks for pointing out how unclear I was.
Yeah, I apologize.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, thank you.
The situation is that the community rights petition to be heard, that they're bringing up legitimate points of law about local government, those ideas were denied. And that is the job of these judges, which isn't to make new law, that's what the Supreme Court can do, but they were denied. So no, there are no successes at that level, if that's how you want to define success of community rights.
So if I'm understanding things correctly, basically the idea right now is to get these things happening enough to build critical mass to get it all the way to the Supreme Court and hope for a decision in our favor.
Well, I think that's part of it. It's not totally
I mean,
a judicial,
yeah,
yes, that would be great if that happened, okay, but I think there's more things involved. For example, getting critical mass in a number of states so that when one county passes one of these, a bunch of others do too, and you don't just have one county, you have a lot of people doing the same kind of thing. There's also the recognition that when you reach a certain level in a state or states, that they may be in a position to address their own state laws, state corporate code, and state constitution, and make some changes there about the preemptions or Dillon's rule and so on. And also, ultimately, some changes at the federal level. But yes, it would be great if some of these went up to a federal appellate court and got a positive decision. Yes.
I feel very hopeful in that the states that are passing legalized marijuana is going to supersede anything that the federal government is trying to suppress. So with what you say here today, it can be done. And it starts out from one step at a time, and it continues to roll. And that's just one example, but there's many that run parallel to people putting a ballot initiative forward and having people vote on it and pass it in spite of what the federal government and all their rules and regulations say.
So the marijuana case is really interesting because the drug laws about marijuana are such a mess in this country. No one really knows where they are. There's all these federal laws and obvious conflict with state laws, and yet states are going forward and have for years in promulgating with great research and preparation beforehand. How are we going to handle this new thing? So it's kind of like, la la la, it's all going on. None of it is consistent. It doesn't make sense together, but it's a good example of an area of law which is in great tumult now and hasn't been resolved yet. But it can be a positive example for positive change too. Good example, yes, ma'am.
How do you feel about Proposition 63 being passed in California? Do you think it has the same weight as some of the marijuana laws?
Please remind me what that is.
It's the gun control.
I'm not familiar with it, just give me a,
Oh, well, they banned.
it's a pro-gun control law that was just passed this week.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've had a heck of a
On
week,
big
sorry, I
ones.
need to go back and read a lot of news, but, okay. And what about them? They passed a strong pro-gun control law in California, and please tell me what you're asking, or,
I'm wondering if that's, will have the same kind of weight. I mean, certainly they'll be able to enact all of the portions of that proposition, won't they? If the state passes it.
okay. I'm just going to say that all of this that I've had a chance to read in any detail is complicated, I'm sorry, I keep saying that, I really don't want to be up here and misrepresent it as really straightforward. But one of the most complicated aspects of our current system is the relationship between federal laws, state laws, and local laws. Many of us in this room may feel one way about it when it comes to gun control, another way when it comes to marijuana, another way when it comes to controlling federal lands, and so on. So it is really complicated, and I'm not familiar with the California law. I wouldn't assume that it's going to be able to be applied because it may be in conflict with some federal laws. I'm definitely not an expert on that. So it is not a simple situation, yes.
Along those same lines, but off on a different track. With the ACA and the current proposals to take regulation of health insurance companies away from state insurance commissioners and to allow a national market to occur across state lines where citizens have no control at all over what happens inside their state as far as coverage, and discipline of insurance companies who fail to fulfill their contracts. When you've got that possibility, and then in the workplace, where you have certain states with very poor laws in place for workers' compensation, where those workers would benefit from a national standard, how do you reconcile all of this?
First of all, regarding the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, I do have 2 articles about it on my website. They do not address what you just asked, which is a detailed question of the fight that's coming on about it now between states and the federal government, between the new president-elect trying to wreck it and other people's trying to save part of it. So I don't know enough about the details of it to comment on it. But talking about workers' comp laws, you know, I grew up thinking that the federal government, and especially the Supreme Court, were heroes because they took care of getting rid of segregation, and they saved endangered species. It's just a real simplistic thing, but that's what was in my head before I actually started reading about the law. And I had no idea how complicated the role of the Supreme Court was. And I had no idea that in many cases, a movement to a federal law instead of a state law was something that didn't really help the causes that I favored. And in fact, a lot of the movements, like there was a movement in the late 19th century for federal chartering of corporations. It was led by corporations. It wasn't led by citizen reformers. Because they would rather deal with one federal government doing it than 50 states, just and the mess that made. Okay, now they've reconciled to the 50 states and they're making a lot of mileage out of it. But it's not always clear that kicking something up to federal standards is going to be a good thing. A lot of things in federal standards we used to think of as floors, and the states could do something more stringent or stricter. Now, a lot of federal laws are being interpreted by the courts as ceilings, a strictness beyond which the states may not go. It cannot be stricter or more protective than the federal laws. So it's really
Isn't that
complicated, but it's not obvious which in fact would be better, including workers' comp, which actually replaced a system where the people who did something wrong paid. And workers' comp, although it helped a lot of people and may have been a good idea, it set up a system where, you know, everyone is going to be sloppy and somehow, you know, what was collected from everyone would cover things, as opposed to punishing like corporations that had unsafe working conditions. The workers' comp setup actually benefited a lot of corporations with terrible conditions because it spread the cost of the liability around. I'm sorry, yeah.
I was reminded of the recent Monsanto Dark Act, where, states were passing GMO labeling laws. And and like we saw with the ballot initiative, the legalization of marijuana, both medical and recreational. And the movement really pushing to have this happen. And so Monsanto sued Vermont recently, most recently. And then they tackled it from the federal level, and they passed the Dark Act, which says that, everybody's gotta have a standard, it's gotta be the same standard, and yes,
So
we'll
this is
have.
the new federal act you're talking about,
Yes,
yeah.
but yet they're barcodes, so unless you have a barcode scanner, you can't really know what, right?
There's a lot of levels of fakery and making it look like we're doing something when really, in fact, we're helping the other side.
Exactly.
And if activists and their friends don't all read the fine print on exactly what this labeling law is about, you may end up supporting an organic law or a labeling law that you think sounds good, but really is working against small producers and real organic and so on. And yes, that's happening. So there's a lot of problems with that. A lot would be helped if corporations didn't have infinite ability to continue appealing things.
Right.
So removing 14th Amendment protections would help a lot. It's not the whole thing, but it would help a lot.
Well, and then you mentioned Citizens United, and I know there have been many states, 16 last I checked, that passed resolutions saying that we support the repeal of. Listen to your perspective. I can understand while that is really secondary instead of primary. Maybe the focus should be more on what was written, that you had shared with us. However, even locally, then they're going in and they're trying to get municipalities to pass those resolutions in order to get the states that have not yet done so to concur, and the hope of building coalitions at the ground level and hoping to eventually over time have a greater impact to hold a constitutional convention for an amendment, right?
Okay, yeah, I think that I disagree with you. I have several articles on my site, and they're short. Most of the stuff on my site is short, including things on how to use a law library and stuff if you're interested. I have a couple articles on there on Citizen United, which I think will add more than I can in a short time now. But my take on it right now is that this is a huge effort, and it's aiming at almost nothing. Not nothing, but tiny. And if we're going to make a huge effort, let's aim at something bigger. Maybe even rewriting the Federal Elections Act of 1974. Because McCain-Feingold, frankly, I'm sorry to say, Feingold used to be my guy, was a nothing. So I hate to see us spending huge efforts on something and having people working for it sort of exaggerate the changes that it will bring. Why don't we start with something like what I wrote you and then modify or compromise if we have to, as opposed to starting with something, in my opinion, as minor as Citizens United. And please, if you're interested, do check the couple articles on that on my site.
And I was just, it's not that this is my track, I'm just saying this is what's been happening.
Yeah.
And I found it interesting that perspective, that paradigm shift and what you shared. I found that interesting since I personally was not aware that, when you look at the laws, the way they were written and what the functions of it is it's very enlightening.
Well, something like Citizens United, here's another angle on it, and you may disagree with this too, many of you. But that is a great way to raise money. It sounds great. You've got even mainstream politicians saying, yeah, they're in favor of it. It's great, you get all these petitions, foundations want to give you money, all this is good. And frankly, if you look at it, I think it will make hardly any difference. So all this effort is going into that, instead of what, community rights or other efforts at the local level, for example.
I just want to interject here real quick before I forget with everything else going on. I really want to thank the Green Sanctuary Committee of the Unitarian Universalist congregation, especially Catherine Allen here, who has kind of, she's been washing dishes while we're enjoying Jane Ann Lawrence. Progressive Action for the Common Good, the Economic Justice Forum, for providing some of the financing, and the collaboration with the Environmental Forum. What issues Jane Ann has been talking about actually is something that is pretty much connected with about everything that Progressive Action for the Common Good has been working on historically. And we are working on a forum or
Are you talking about the Progressive Summit?
yes.
Okay, I'm Elsa Price. I'm right now the president of the board of Progressive Action for the Common Good. And we're trying to formulate a response to the unpleasantness of this last week. And, but anyway, we're proposing to get, various progressive groups, faith leaders, minority rights groups, and so on, those organizations together to plan to have a progressive summit, hopefully about a week before the inauguration, and to identify what are, I'm calling them for right now, the emergency issues, the things that are going to be under threat in the first 100 days, and have the groups that are working on all of those in those areas do some planning, unfortunately, right through the holiday season, so that we're ready to go at the summit to give people ideas of actions that could be taken on all of these issues. But this right now is just something that Progressive Action is spearheading, but we have not yet met with the other organizations, so we're trying to plan that meeting for right after Thanksgiving. So that's kind of what we're working on.
So you can be looking for that in the Progressive Action for the Common Good electronic digital newsletter.
Yeah.
And keep your eyes open for that. But I do want to thank, I want to note that Alta's the president, Dan is on the board, I'm on the board, and Ann's on the board of PACG. I don't know if we have anybody
And Ann
else.
McCluskey, the two Anns. Oh, and Cliff.
Cliff, we're all,
Oh, that's right, Cliff's on the board too. Yeah, I'm a little fried, forget
Yeah,
it.
that's okay.
Incriminate all of it,
What's that?
incriminate all of it.
Yeah, and I want to thank Cliff and my friend Carson Berry for helping with video recording this. Corinne for stepping in there to take care of the book sales at the last minute, hey, whatever. Crystal DeFati, who has brought some stuff and volunteered to help coordinate some of this, and Shannon Strombeck, which left with her little girl, and she was broken into also, who kind of helped coordinate everything and brought all sorts of extra food and all sorts of stuff. So I did not want to forget to thank actually everybody here who participated. I mean, people brought food. It's an example of a community coming together in Davenport. But we're not done with the Q&A, are we?
Of course not.
Yeah, I just didn't want to forget, you know. And you too, Bill, by the way, who was very helpful in getting transportation arranged for all this.
Professor Morris is a professor, right?
No, it's
No,
Jane Ann, sir.
Okay.
Okay.
Question,
Right.
or not a question. As a corporate anthropologist, could
Yes.
you, maybe for the enlightenment, reminder to some of us, the debate, the discussion between Jefferson and whoever it was, Hamilton, about the whole issue of corporations, that Jefferson, I understand, didn't want them originally back in the beginning of the country, and we sort of lost that debate, but maybe you could enlighten us on that whole discussion.
I don't know that much about that discussion per se. I do know that there were corporations early on, and George, somewhere in the POCAD materials, George Washington had a bunch of corporations that he made big money from and so on, but there weren't that many corporations around then, and I cannot address a specific argument between Hamilton and Jefferson on it, but I'll make myself a note.
Okay, as I recall, Jefferson was death on corporations. He said that would be the demise and downfall of democracy, blah, blah, blah. Corporations end up taking over everything. That's my understanding. It's been so long ago.
Well, the
but-
thing is that at that time, corporations, there was much less difference among the different kinds of corporations. You know, there are municipal corporations, nonprofits, charitable, church corporations, for-profit corporations, and so on. And they were much more alike than they are now. They've all diverged a lot. So I don't even know which kind we'd be talking about here. But I can't believe that Jefferson would be against all corporations, because one of the goals of the early corporation was a really good one. Say you had a school, and it was owned by a bunch of people, and of course they started getting old, but the school had a good reputation. They wanted the school to continue as an institution, to take that institution and call it for certain very limited purposes, a legal person made sense. That way the school could go on and own land and do certain things and keep itself going as an institution in the community, so.
I think it was to call them, make them real persons like they did under Citizens United, but that's all right.
Well, I have myself a note, I will be looking into
Read a
that.
bit about it more recently. I don't know, I don't have a whole lot in my head still about it, but you're along the right lines. He wasn't wanting them to be completely abolished, but it was just heavily regulated so that they wouldn't have the ability to just swamp individuals or trample on the rights of communities, for lack of a better way to say it. So
I'll definitely have to look into that, thank you.
That's right.
Other comments or observations?
I have a comment.
Oh, yes, ma'am.
You're talking about the XL pipeline with the Dakota pipeline in South Dakota, and it's coming through Iowa and Illinois. They have a right to voice their opinion with their protest, because they are under federal law because of the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Department of Interior.
Wait a minute, could you go back and tell me who the they is? I'm not sure I
The Standing
understood.
Rock Sioux.
Oh, okay.
They're the
All right.
ones who are protesting. I'm online with them. I signed a petition, and not only did I stand up for the Standing Rock Sioux, so did Leonardo DiCaprio he's the actor from the Titanic, and Chris Hemsworth also stood up with them. Jill Stein went out there and stood up with them, because they can't say, the government can't just say they don't have burial sites along that route. From North Carolina, where my mom was from, with the Eastern Band of Cherokee and the Trail of Tears to Oklahoma, there are burial sites along the southern route and the northern route, and I was at one in Missouri. And there's a monument there because it's one of the daughters who died there crossing the river, the Mississippi River. So this is a big issue here, and the same as like Flint, Michigan with water. Even former Senator Paul,
Wellstone.
pardon me?
Wellstone?
No, he's from Illinois, Paul Simon. I met him at Bradley University, and he said one of these days, water is gonna be the most precious commodity in this country. And look what's happening today. Exactly that. So I'm part of one of those activists. And another statement I want to make, do you remember the 3 Mile Island in New York?
Oh, do I, yes.
Regulatory mattered nothing. That famous actor was in that movie. He couldn't do a thing about it. It was a disaster. And I don't think they're teaching history to kids in school now. So some of them probably, have you ever heard of the 3 Mile Island? I bet they haven't.
That's Harrisburg, Pennsylvania.
Yes. So that's another thing that people need to start paying attention to. It's called We the People, not just Washington, D.C. I'm also with the Humane Society of the United States, so.
We're making plans with PACG to show that in the near future, there's a new one, We the People 2.0.
Oh, good. That would be good.
Can I ask you, Jane, what are your thoughts on, with NAFTA, some of these trade laws that supersede or trump any,
Okay, she's asking about NAFTA, free trade, quote unquote, whether it's TPP, CAFTA, NAFTA, WAFTA, SHAFTA. I always thought it sounded like the name of a shampoo, NAFTA.
Yes.
Free trade is not primarily about trade, and it has nothing to do about anybody's freedom except the freedom of corporations to sue and basically intimidate governments into buckling down. This whole book is about free trade, and it's about the free trade zone that was established within the United States, which was a model for WTO and NAFTA. That's what it's about, and it was established by our own unelected tribunal in the U.S. Supreme Court. So that's what this is about. So I'm against all those free trade agreements.
Bill Clinton came to the college where I was working. Robert Rogers was with him, and they were trying to sell people NAFTA.
1974.
They have 300 vacant houses in Galesburg, Illinois. that they've lost their jobs and everything. Now I'm concerned with the Cordova nuclear power plant. They close 800 people will be out of the job. That's what they're looking at.
So we're trying to get it so that they can force the subsidies for the taxpayers. We're trying to.
Yeah, for a change, right?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah.
The Attorney General saying, don't tell us that.
It's about Cordova. I know,
Is that in Illinois?
yes.
Well, thank you so much, Jerry.
Thank you, everybody.